to talk about big numbers today. They're going to be, during construction, we'll be talking about large numbers. But before we get into the numbers, I want to do a little bit of a mental exercise, almost like brain training, just to stretch your brain a little bit. And it'll prepare you for the rest of the presentation. So from where you're sitting, you don't have to get up and don't turn around. I want you to visualize how many chairs are in this room right now. I'll give you maybe 2 seconds to come up with a number. So the actual number of chairs is 151. How many people came up with that? Yeah, sure. I don't believe you. So, and it's 151, including the 6 chairs over here, the 2 chairs by the video station, and there's 1 hidden there. I counted. I didn't figure it out myself. I counted it earlier. But the point of this is that it's very difficult for the brain to understand large numbers, and it doesn't take a lot of numbers for the brain to lose sight of what the number means. So since we're talking about really, really large numbers, in particular we're talking about 1 billion players, I want to go through a little bit of a metaphor so that we can understand what that number means. And the billion players we're talking about is the next billion players that are going to drive the games industry forward. So you've seen in many of the presentations during this conference, actually, that the age of the average player is quite high. So the average player is over 20 years old. So you can't expect the next players to just come from children, right? Children are not going to necessarily be the future of this industry within the next 3 to 5 years. And in fact, the industry is going to add about 1 billion new players very soon. So let's imagine for a second that we're inside of an elevator with 8 people. Now, 8 is an easy number, I think, for us to think through. You can think about the number 12, for instance. If you go to the store to buy a dozen eggs and 1 is missing, you instantly, even Costa would know that there are only 11 eggs left, right? So 8 is a very easy number to sort of conceptualize. And there will soon be 8 billion people on the planet in just the next couple years. So each of these people can represent 1 billion. So imagine these 8 people. The most shocking fact, I think, is that only 2 of them play games. So this whole audience probably plays games. Most of my group of friends play games. I've been in the games industry for 12 years. So everybody I know plays games. So it's shocking to me that the minority of the world plays games, right? So the big question here is the value of these players. 2 billion players represent $116 billion annually. Now, that's not just games being paid for or microtransactions. That's, of course, it includes hardware and peripherals dedicated to gaming. But still, what this means is that the question of where the next billion is going to come from, that's a $58 billion question. And even if you assume that the value of the next billion is going to be a little lower, which I think it is, right, because of the business model, we probably won't see another 50% of growth when we get another billion players. Maybe it'll be $30 billion added to the market. That's still a pretty large opportunity. Now, we can do a little bit of quick math to start to narrow in on what we're talking about. And when I talk about the next billion, we're going to talk about where they're from, so what countries, what technological infrastructure they have, what kinds of games they might play, or what kinds of monetization models we can look at. But to make this easier, we can do something right away, which is remove half the audience. So 4 out of 8 people in the world don't even have internet access, right? So that's half the world right away taken out of the equation, because these days, so when I was growing up, the only thing you needed to be a game-playing market was electricity in stores, right? All you needed to do was be able to go to a store and go home and plug in a machine. Nowadays, because of connected play, because of digital distribution, the internet and the speed of internet is actually a determining factor on whether or not a market can be good for playing games. So now we've got only 2 billion people left, 2 billion candidates that we can look at, so we can start to really narrow in on how to solve this problem of who's next. So before I get into the stats, I'm going to show you some charts. I want to explain why I'm even talking to you about this, why this topic matters to me. So I work for Akamai. If you don't know the name Akamai, you probably use Akamai every single day and just don't realize it. So Akamai is one of the world's largest cloud distribution platforms. We've got servers all over the world, and we work with most of the world's game companies to distribute most of the world's games. So if you've downloaded a game on your PC, or if you've updated a game on your phone, if you've watched a television show on the internet, if you've downloaded a movie or installed software, you probably touched Akamai. Now, that's a perfect bragging opportunity for us, but the real point of that is that because of that access that we have, we get to see a lot of information. So we touch most of the world's players. We get to see network health all over the world. We get to see how that network's health is changing, and we get to see how people interact. So we've produced for many years a State of the Internet report, which gives the world a view of how the network is changing, and actually telecom companies rely on that data to plan out their own networks. So this is, for us, a treasure trove of information that helps us understand the markets better. That's why this is relevant to us. So in order to determine the markets that are going to come online soon, we looked at just a couple basic things. The one thing that we looked for is countries where there's a highly connected population, where lots of people in those countries are connected to the internet, where the speed of connection is good and growing. So there's one thing to be connected to the internet. It's another thing for that speed to be viable for gameplay. And the third thing we looked at is viable economics. So countries where the gross national income is high enough to sustain spend on something additional like gaming. Now, direct spend is not the only model. As you've probably seen some of the sessions here where they talk about ad-supported business, about rewarded video views, maybe even subscription models are going to start to become part of the games industry. And we can touch on that a little bit, but I think you'll see that the GNI is still going to be an important factor in the emerging markets. So this is the big eye chart slide. Now, for a second, don't pay attention yet to the countries list, because we'll get into that in some detail. I want to point out the three columns that are really important here. So the first column to pay attention to is the number of internet users in a country. So that's not the population of each of these countries, that's the number of connected users. The second column is the average connection speed. And so we see the connection speed for every single user who comes to download a bit. So when somebody downloads a piece of software somewhere in the world and they connect with us, we get to see the average speed of that user. So then we get to see users, millions and millions of users every month. The third column that matters here is the average speed growth rate, so the compound annual growth rate of the internet speed. Now, if we look at average speed for a second, you'll notice if you scan the list that almost every country listed here has a speed higher than 6 megabits per second. Now, 6 megabits per second we think is an important waterline. Anything below 6 megabits per second means that you're not going to have a great experience. Now, 6 megabits per second is going to impact the download of the initial file. It's going to impact updates. It's going to also impact multiplayer, right? So for us, 6 megabits per second is the logical limit. Some people would argue that 2 megabits per second is okay. You might have an okay multiplayer experience. And there are some developers who come up with clever ways to hide latency, or depending on where the servers, there are a lot of factors that can allow you to maybe play with lower speeds. But anything below 6 megabits per second, you're going to see is not yet a viable, stable gaming market. And I'm going to point out a country here that I think helps tell that story. If you take a look, so I'm going to ignore Asia for a second because I think that's a big part of the story. But something that you see sprinkled here in terms of countries is you see a couple of Latin American countries pop up. You see Mexico, which shows up as the 6th, I guess. You see Brazil, shows up as the 3rd, and Argentina. Now, what's interesting about these countries is if you take a look at Brazil, that's 140 million connected users with a speed higher than 6 megabits per second. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see Brazil start to show up on all the charts in the conference here. I've seen a couple sessions where Brazil is showing up as a significant player in monetization, where they're a significant player in mobile games. And you see, they're starting to show up in the competitive esports circuit. And there's no coincidence, I think, that Brazil, just 3 or 4 years ago, was lower than 6 megabits per second, right? So they're now emerging as one of the sort of entry players in the emerging market because of the size of the population and the speed of the connection. And you're going to see, I think, very shortly, some similar things with Mexico and with Argentina, particularly if, as an industry, we can come up with clever ways to monetize, right? If you've got these markets where the average player is not willing to or not able to pay for the game, if there are other ways to monetize, it might be interesting. So another set of countries that you'll see listed here is countries in Africa. So if you look at the bottom, we've indicated in dark gray the cases where either the speed doesn't quite meet the level that we think it's ready, or where the gross national income is not high enough. But if you look at Africa, there's a couple really kind of shocking things there. In Nigeria, you've got 91 million connected people, right? So internet connections in Nigeria, that's half of the country's population connected. The speeds are not quite there yet, but in 3 years, the speeds are going to double, right? So that's an interesting market. Another market to look at is Kenya. What's shocking about Kenya is there are 43 million connected people in Kenya. That's almost 90% of the population. And they're connecting at speeds double that of some Western European nations. Now, here's another thought about Latin America and Africa. Something that came up yesterday in the App Annie presentation is the fact that some of the Asian markets, some of them are very mature, developed markets, they're seen as closed markets. So, for example, the game market in the key cities in China that tend to play games that come out of China or the surrounding region. Same thing for Korea, same thing for Japan. But in Mexico, Brazil, Kenya, Nigeria, there's not a mature, fully developed game development market, which means the players in Nigeria and Kenya and Brazil and Mexico, they're playing games from other parts of the world. That represents significant opportunity for the people in this room. And as the previous presentation showed, some of the game types actually overlap. Some of the game types in the Russian market, some of the game types in the Eastern European market overlap with the emerging markets. Now, I don't want to ignore Asia, and I will talk a little bit more about it. Of course, you'll see China is its own interesting beast, but India, I think, represents a significant opportunity. Again, if we can come up with clever monetization models. So you've seen, and we can talk a little bit more about this later, this chart is actually just one piece of our research. We've worked on this for several months. I have a guy on my team, Jonathan Singer, who started his career as an analyst for the telecommunications industry. So he's got a very complex database tracking this, and I'm happy to talk some more about it after the session or sometime later. We don't have a big party today, right? So we can just talk about this all night. We can just hang out and talk about numbers. So we know where some of the countries are, and I think what's also going to be interesting about the next billion players is I think they're going to be heavily mobile. I don't think that's a huge surprise, right? But some stats about mobile penetration that I think are relevant is right now there are in 2016 there were 4.8 billion mobile subscriptions, and within the next couple years that's going to go up by close to 1 billion. So 5.7 billion subscriptions. Now, subscriptions does not mean people, right? So it may not be that there are 1 billion more people who sign on for mobile subscriptions, but it still represents significant growth. And 71% of internet users in Asia on mobile play games. So mobile subscriptions is closely aligned with gameplay or game adoption, right? Because the first thing that you do when you buy a new phone is you install a messaging app, right? And the second thing you do is you install a game. So I think that mobile, it's something that we have to look at. And this data comes from the GSMA, which is basically the leading mobile standards organization. Now, the other thing that the next billion players will be is you're going to see a good chunk of them come out of India. I think that it's a country that I didn't focus on before because it's such a big opportunity. It deserves its own session, and in fact, there is a session this afternoon specifically on India. Interesting thing about India, we've got a large team there. One of my team members actually is based in Bangalore, and he's a gamer. And he's described that he doesn't really play console games because of how expensive the machines are and how expensive the games are. And he also, when he plays PC games, he plays at a PC cafe. Most of his gaming is on a mobile phone. The average smartphone in India costs maybe 7,000 rupees, so it's very affordable. It's a much more accessible market. So as we look at these emerging markets, there's just no way to ignore mobile. The other thing, and I know this is controversial because I was at a session yesterday where it was nearly an argument broke out about this, but free-to-play is, I think, going to be a key driver for some of these emerging markets to reach that next billion-player group. And part of the reason for that is that it's a huge market, even outside of mobile. So even on PC and Mac, about 65% of PC and Mac gaming revenue within the next couple of years is going to come from free-to-play games. It's going to be a $24 billion chunk of the business. And I'm not a huge personal fan of free-to-play mechanics because I like buying the game and just playing it through and not having to worry about gates. But the reality is, for much of the world, it's a required part of the ecosystem. And a fact that I think is important to know: the birth rate in the world is 130 million people a year. So there's 130 million babies born every year. That's not enough people to add to the market. So the market's going to have to come from emerging countries. And one way to think of it is the emerging countries are, if you think about the growth rate of the speed of their connection, these were places that were almost in shadow in terms of the internet. And they're going to start to emerge, right? I've been going to game conferences for 12 years. We never talk about Africa. We never talk about Latin America. Very little do we talk about Southeast Asia. And these are places that basically 5 years ago couldn't reliably download a big game. And now you're going to find that that's going to start to be the case. So in 5 years, don't be surprised when that becomes a sizable market. And if you ignore it, you only have yourself to blame. The last thing that I want to say about the next billion players is they're going to be via 5G. How many of you are paying attention to 5G? One person. So 5G is coming very quickly, and it is a very different way to think about mobile architecture, mobile infrastructure, and it's going to represent significant change in the way that we can interact with people connected over 5G, or connected over mobile networks. There's a company that I know that's working on a subscription service that relies on streaming, which we know game streaming has been, and I don't mean esports, but pixel streaming has been a very tricky market, and there's a possibility that 5G is going to change that. In addition, 5G has the potential to change the way we think about multiplayer on mobile and how rich the experiences can be on mobile. This is actually a chart of the expected growth rate of 5G connections over the next, I guess that's 7 years. And this is a list of countries that are launching their 5G network. So Korea Telecom is going to be launching a 5G network in 2019. Japan is going to be launching soon after. China in 2020. This is not far away. This is within the next 2 years. You're going to see 5G networks launch in all of the key markets. Now, interestingly, you'll see them launch first in the established markets, in the markets where the 2 billion players already live, the existing game markets of North America, Western Europe, Japan, Korea, some of the key cities in China. But 5G isn't going to be just isolated to those markets. It's going to start to spread beyond that. And I think you'll see significant opportunity. So in summary, I think the next billion players, they're going to be heavily mobile and free to play. They're going to be in Asia Pacific and Latin America and soon after, I think, in Africa. And 5G is going to fundamentally shape how those new billion players interact with us. And it's going to shape the way everybody, the entire 3 billion player base, interacts with us. I hope this is useful to you. I would love to chat more about it. There's a lot of data behind it. And I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you, Nelson.